Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. Fans were shocked at Dan Blocker's passing. The entire world. The 43-year-old man who made the well-known Cartwright was abruptly disappeared. It seemed premature, too abruptly. The official justification provided a simple yet heartbreaking story. However, behind that version contained a maze of unresolved queries, ambiguous medical difficulties, strange discrepancies, and persistent gossip regarding his funeral. Everybody strengthened the feeling that something didn't add up quite a bit. A portion of it was dismissed as rumors from Hollywood. Silently, the others interred. However, more than 50 years later, more information is bringing new viewpoint and questioning that we've heard this tale for years. For many, the actual conclusion can be much more disturbing than they initially believed they were aware. Little Joe may now have been the Cartwrights' love interest clan, captivating audiences with his excellent appearance and effortless grin. Yet for a lot of fans, actually, it was Hos'n large, timid, and incredibly generous person who genuinely captured hearts. Something so disarming was present, concerning him. A kind giant with a youthful purity and that recognizable puppy dog sincerity. The worst part is still to come. Hos's creator, Dan Blocker, was already shattering records as soon as he came into the world. Born in December in Dalb, Texas, on the 10th of 1928, he weighed a startling 14 pounds at birth, still the Bowie County's heaviest infant ever born. Shortly after Dan's birth, his parents, Mary and Ora Shack Blocker, Arizona, relocated the family to O'Donnell, Texas, a little community of roughly 40 miles south of Luck. Shack was a farmer, once had been severely impacted by the Great Depression. However, instead of caving in, he established a little food store with what he had not much left. The household resided in the rear of that shop, eking out a living, while young Dan offered assistance wherever he could. He would transport grocery bags, tow-stock shelves, consumer vehicles, and essentially serve as the store's kind excessive muscle. As per local in the past, Shack would joke that he would pay someone to use Dan merely to prevent the child from unintentionally ruining the location with his enormous size. Dan's size rapidly grew to fame in O'Donnell. Additionally, he used it, not merely to sit on it. When once, a C. Pepley news reporter inquired him if he was familiar with, Blocker just smiled while fighting, and as it turns out on Saturday, evenings in that small town in West Texas, residents would congregate for amusement, and Dan was frequently the source of amusement. A portion of the main street would be roped off, and Dan would compete against anyone courageous enough to oppose him. He turned into like a gladiator in a little town. Later, he stated that he never lost a battle, very likely because he was even an adolescent when standing 6'3" and weighing 275 pounds. Dan had enrolled by the time he was 13, located at the Texas Military Institute. He rose to fame on the football field very fast, linebacker in the field. His power, and because of his athleticism, he received a scholarship too. He studied at Sul Ross State University, kept playing football, while English is the major. Just 18 years old, he was already a powerful presence, almost 300 pounds, and continues gaining weight. However, football wasn't the factor that altered his life, it was a play. The university's The Drama Group was performing Old and Arsonic Lace, and they required a powerful individual to transport bulky items throughout the stage. Dan offered their services, and they were enamored with that they gave him a minor part, Teddy Brewster's eccentricity. That particular one a spark was ignited by role. On the stage, feeling the energy, hearing the crowd, everything clicked. Dan Blocker became enamored. He switched from English as his major to theatre and didn't turn around. Following after graduating, he allegedly declined chances to play professional football. Rather, he went east, following Theaspire to work as a theatrical actor. He made a cut his teeth in reparative and summer stock theatre, gradually developing his resume and honing his craft. Finally, obtained a small role in a Broadway King Lear's production. However, it's like thus Dan, like many young guys in his generation, Blocker acted without hesitation when his nation called. He enlisted in the military and was sent to the conflict in Korea, where he worked as a sergeant in combat infantry. with 2nd Battalion, Company F, the 45th Infantry Regiment, 179th Infantry Division. Following arrival, Dan was already in the front, Incheon lines by 1951's Christmas Day. He and At Chwin, his fellow soldiers, dug in area that is currently a part of North Korea. They hosted the Jamestown Line, a reinforced area at the front where the conflict had escalated to a heated, tiresome standstill. It turned into a vicious back-and-forth game, taking and capturing hills, engaging in combat from trenches, and residing in its midst 4 months. Blocker and the infantry, 179th, the regiment spent time in that meat grinder, an incredible 209 days. Once, he was even hurt, hurrying to assist a comrade in arms. Just the type of courage that would subsequently come to characterize his host Cartwright's on-screen character. From between December 1951 and June 1952, his unit was enmeshed in the intense combat over the strategically important Porkchop Hill earth that assisted in managing the vital Baldy's old job. It wasn't only the combat that exhausted soldiers. The summertime, heat, unrelenting dirt, and uncooked, everything was made worse by nerves. Lastly, following months on the front, in July 1952 Blocker's unit was dragged back in lines. To recuperate, he was taken to a hospital. He recovered from his wounds by August, and he was travelling home while wearing a Purple Heart hand. However, upon his return to civilian life, acting wasn't even a part of 1952 life, the strategy. What was the Los Angeles move? Angeles. He married his wife in the same year, Dolphia Parker, a college sweetheart. Anyone who is 5'3" and Texan just Dolph was called. Together, they constructed a living away from the limelight, elevating Deborah, twin daughters, and 4 children, Dana, Lynn, Lee, and their 2 kids, Davidus, well as Dirk. Having a small family to support, Dan did what many people were going to do. Troops did. He returned to his studies. He obtained a master's degree in drama arts and began working as a high school teacher, Sonora, Texas, theater and English. He later worked as a 6th grade teacher in New Mexico. He seemed to be nudged by each employment. Westward, a silent shuffle, in the direction of his genuine calling. He truly cared for instructing. He was naturally connected with children and expressed his enthusiasm for bringing speech and behavior into the classroom. Colleagues and friends frequently remarked that he had a golden heart, perhaps easily irritated, yet equally eager to apologize. Relocating California wasn't a place to chase celebrity wager. It was about carrying on with his instruction. Dan started working at UCLA, pursuing a doctorate in dramatic arts, while still doing part-time teaching. However, fate has a humorous method of intervening. One day, utilizing a campus phone booth, a casting scout noticed Blocker. He has a Texas appearance and a large frame. He fit the explosion well, of westerns on TV taking over screens at the moment, and Dan was also aware of it. Being large has benefits, he once stated, particularly while making the rounds in the offices of agents. They remember you, hurriedly. From that point on, the momentum started to increase. He began landing little portions on vintage westerns displays. Colt .45, Gunsmoke, The Have Gun Will Travel, Rifleman, and coming up for an episode here, Maverick and There. He got a few movie roles, also, but TV was where he truly discovered his balance. Between 1957 and 1958, he had The Restless Gun's semi-regular place, a cowboy series set after the Civil War. Additionally, he was cast in a recurring role on City of Cimarron. When that performance was cancelled, it might have seemed lifeless. Conclusion, but it was anything but. The door was opened by that cancellation for a position which would transform everything, the endearing bigger-than-life Bonanza Cartwright, in a show that's packed featuring vibrant figures. If Little Joe was the romantic partner, Hoss was the heartbeat, steady, powerful, and profoundly cherished. Being Ben's middle son Cartwright, a prosperous rancher who resides on Hoss, stood at the Ponderosa, ranch in Nevada out for his stature alone, his straightforward, his large heart, and his character. Paradoxically, the figure was frequently depicted as slow-witted and even credulous, is a far cry from Dan Blocker's actual self, who was really bright and considerate. Perhaps Hos was uncomfortable, but particularly in the presence of women, and readily tricked by a skillfully executed joke. But what set him apart was his unending empathy. The location of Blocker's spirit was so evident. He poured, bringing compassion and heart to the position, developing a persona that struck a chord profoundly with viewers, particularly children. A lot of people thought Hos had a juvenile innocence. As well as Blocker's sincere, his sole audiences came from his kindness. Couldn't ignore. Blocker was motivated by an influential 18th century quotation, Stephen Grellet, a Quaker missionary, which profoundly impacted his approach life and, in many respects, the personality of Hos. The notion that we merely go through life once and ought to be kind became a guiding principle wherever feasible. Idea for him. Regarding Bonanza, it wasn't your typical Western. It was occurrence broadcasting at a moment when the American screens were dominated by genre. Bonanza left a lasting impression. It focused on Ben's Cartwrights and his three boys, each with unique characters and plots. What might be a standard shoot-them-up Westerns become character-driven drama involving loyalty, family, and fairness. Unbelievably, however, Bonanza nearly didn't make it through the first season. The ratings were horrible, slotted opposing the well-liked courtroom drama on Saturday evenings. Perry Mason's show not even able to make the top 30. NBC was all set to disconnect. Next came the choice that changed the game. The network rescheduled Bonanza for Sunday evenings at 9 p.m. It was a risk, but it paid off. The show found its audience and became popular, continuing for 14 seasons. Chevrolet stepped up as a significant sponsor, and during the season, the show's viewership skyrocketed, too. Nevertheless, creating a color western in things weren't cheap. In the late 1950s, every one episode was approximately $15,000, an astounding sum for the period, and often exceeded the budget. West on NBC Thomas Sarnoff, a Coast executive, had persuaded the leadership of New York not to get rid of it. He pledged to maintain everything in line in terms of money, and he succeeded. From there, Bonanza rose to prominence, adored in homes all throughout the nation. In the background, Dan Blocker had a close relationship with Hos, too deep at times. A conversation with Blocker and broadcaster Cactus Pryor acknowledged that in the beginning of the series, has struggled to distance himself from the personality. During the initial seasons, he claimed to be Hos Cartwright, who was nearly present. The timepiece. However, as the series developed, so did he come close. After a while, he discovered to abandon the character on the nighttime set and return the following morning to fetch him up. Throughout those protracted days of filming, Blocker had a strong relationship with his co-stars, Michael Landon and Lauren Green. The cast wasn't simply behaving as a unit, they were a family. Offset as well, their friendship remained strong. Even so, there was armament that encapsulated Blocker's perseverance exactly. During a scene's filming, he was flung from his horse and fractured his collarbone. Rather than going to the hospital, he manually reset the brake and endured the agony to complete the take. He did take some time off, later to recuperate, in which he put on a little weight. Additionally, when he went back to the set, there was a turnabout, in poetic fairness, the same equine that couldn't carry him any longer. Dan Blocker, at one point in the 1960s, was more than just a TV personality. He was the TV personality. For a while, he was perhaps the most well-known actor on the earth. However, with that degree of notoriety, come at a cost that was more severe than any stage fight in the Ponderosa barroom, the invasion of his privacy. In spite of his friendly, affable character on television, Blocker was frequently surrounded by crowds, overtaken by the same supporters who loved him, one that is especially instructive. The incident occurred in the third season of when Bonanza attempted to savor a straightforward baseball game, a trip with his sons, Dave and Dirk. However, what ought to have been a peaceful family afternoon descended into mayhem. He was besieged by fans for autographs, and the level of attention became so great that he had to collect his children and depart before they even witnessed the initial pitch. Furthermore, it didn't pause at home. Even trips became appears. In public, while traveling to the Yucatan, and his spouse, anticipating a locals, followed him as he made his silent getaway, shouting "Hoz" and "Cababillo," of course. In actuality, there was no such thing as escaping, not when his face was known almost wherever he went. This type of thing is something that people don't frequently consider, the silent worth of not being known. In Blocker's case, the constant acknowledgement became a hardship. Notoriety had brought him not only wealth, but also a profound discomfort. He publicly struggled with the notion of earning a lot of money from acting, particularly when he contrasted it with the low wages for state servants and school teachers' servants. At one point, he admitted that the quantity he made seemed completely immoral. He even made an attempt at one point to go back to his previous position as a teacher. However, the notion was rejected by his old principal, stating plainly that he will always be viewed as Hoss rather than Mr. Blocker. But eventually he managed to take a step back from the confusion. In a conversation with the Blocker, star of Aniston, revealed how heck me up with the notion of relocating his family to Switzerland. The seed was planted by a National Geographic, which included an article about Italy's lake areas in Switzerland. He recalled being captivated. His spouse and he had previously, he assured her that he had visited Europe once, that they would investigate that the following time. Lake country. They travelled in 1970, which proved to be one that changes your life. The family went on a tour. Locations, such as Lake Maggia, Lake Co, and the tiny Swiss town of Lugano on Blocker over entirely. He referred to it as the most exquisite location he'd never observed. They were surprised to learn that they also discovered an American school there in Lugano, which makes it an ideal location for Get a Life. Later in the year, the leap was made by Blockers. They left and relocated to Switzerland with the intention of for tranquility, but for luxury. Blocker was really eager to see what the relocation would provide his kids with access to excellent instruction and the opportunity to learn several languages, as well as the capacity to board a train and travel throughout Europe with comfort. It was like a fresh experience for him. Starting. When news broke of their move, some believed it was related to cash, perhaps a wise tax choice, but Blocker corrected the information. Bonanza has already made him a millionaire. Actually, the shift made matters more difficult. In terms of finances, raising taxes, as well as dual citizenship. Thus, if anything, he paid extra for it. What attracted him most, it was peaceful in Lugano. Similar to his James Aries, Blocker's co-star on Bonanza, had little fascination with the glamour of Hollywood. He didn't want to be the center of attention. Down the aisles of supermarkets. Additionally, in Lugano, he discovered that area. Interestingly, even though Swiss TV broadcast Bonanza, however it only played in southern and German Lugano, is located in Switzerland, which isn't a German-speaking area. That tiny, he was aware of the details. It succeeded, considerably simpler to live under and blend in with the radar. Dan Blocker and his team by 1972, the family had made Switzerland their permanent home, a tranquil shift of pace, although it required taking a plane back to Los Angeles only to the movie Bonanza. It was a challenging routine, yet Blocker stayed dedicated to the performance. However, upon his return to US to begin shooting what might unintentionally become Bonanza's last season, something didn't feel right. He was remarkably worn out, exhausted, and ultimately made a hospital check-in. At that point, medical professionals realized he needed gallbladder surgery. A gallbladder now removal, which is known as a cholecystectomy, is a popular surgical procedure. Each year, more than 1 million Americans possess the process completed, and typically it's regarded as standard. In Blocker's case, it was hoped that this procedure will ultimately stop the discomfort from his gallstones. He'd been fighting for some time. Initially, everything appeared to be going well. He succeeded. During the procedure, and his recuperation appeared to be proceeding smoothly. There was a feeling of relief, as though he was at last returning to the path. However, after that, suddenly, and with little notice, a tragedy occurred. Blocker created embolism in the lungs, an obstruction in one of the pulmonary arteries. It was quick, and it was lethal. In an instant, he was gone. At one point, he felt optimistic and recuperating, and his subsequent life had reached a tragic conclusion. Following his premature demise, an odd and persistent rumor started to spread, one that persists in popular culture discussions till this day. The narrative asserted Dan Blocker, because of his huge, weighing more than 300 pounds, was, instead of being buried in a conventional coffin. It's the type of story that combines some fact with a lots of creativity, but only enough to stick for many years. Most likely, the rumor began as a result of Blocker's bigger presence of life, both physically as well as in terms of personality. People were aware that he was a large man. Additionally, when the subject of his burial, the notion of a customary, because the casket was insufficient, began to disperse. In addition, there is the emotional shock of his unexpected passing, and the narrative developed into a full-fledged urban myth. However, in spite of how dramatic, and the truth is that the picture is strangely captivating, is far more common. Dan Blocker was interred in Woodland in a conventional casket Santa Monica, California cemetery. Despite its persistence, the piano box narrative lacks a factual foundation. It is merely one of those myths that emerged from sorrow, appreciation, as well as a propensity to sensationalize someone's death cherished. Ultimately, the piano box. The legend reminds us of how stories can easily take on a life of their own, particularly in cases where they include someone as recognizable and beloved as Dan Blocker.